To get us started, I'll tell you a quick story. On Wednesday morning of this week, I was at the Livermore High track with some cross-country runners. You may have heard this already, you may not have, but this summer I started coaching JV cross-country at Livermore High. And as we were warming up together, running some laps around the track, some of my runners found out that I some days run twice. That some days our 8 a.m. cross-country practices are the second time I've run that day, having already run at 5:30 in the morning with some of my grown-up running friends. And as this group of runners is discovering this, one of the freshman girls on my team who's been running with me all summer goes, "Wait, you really like this, don't you? Like, running is fun for you." She had been running with me all summer, and she just assumed that no one could really like running. So she assumed, not knowing me very well yet, that my enthusiasm must just be an act. She genuinely thought I was pretending. You know the way that sometimes we do with each other? We're like, "This is fun, right?" No, this is fun, right? Genuinely. And on the Wednesday, she learned the truth and her mind was blown. She was fascinated and she wanted to know how. How could I actually like running? And I told her, because these are the kinds of conversations you have when you just keep running laps. We just talked, and I said, I didn't always like it. When I was a kid, I would spend time running with my dad, and I didn't like it then. I just wanted to spend time with my dad. In high school, I ran because I wanted to be faster than my dad, and I didn't like it then either, but I did like being faster than him. In college, I ran to stay active, and I've discovered that I could like running if I ran with other people. I ran a marathon in my late 20s just to say that I did it, and I liked that people thought it was cool that I was running a marathon, but I didn't like the running part of the marathon. I ran in my 30s because I started to gain weight for the first time because metabolisms change apparently. And again, I was like, oh, I really only like this running thing when I run with other people, so I would try to find people to run with. And it wasn't until my late 30s when, for a variety of factors, I started running 5 or more days a week that literally for the first time in my life, I started to like running. For all those years, right, as a kid, in college, into my 30s, like I ran sometimes. I dabbled in it, like maybe a couple times a week here and there, but it was all sporadic, it was random, it was when I felt like running, and I only felt like running occasionally. But then I embraced running, choosing to run daily, and something began to change, like in me. I started to genuinely enjoy this thing that I was doing almost every day. And I just wanted more of it. I wanted to be better at it. And here's where I actually started to notice what was happening to me. I was running 5 days a week, and then I got COVID. And I couldn't run for like 10 days. And it was the first time I had gone 10 days without running in a while. It had been almost a year at that point. I finally started to feel better after 10 days. I threw on some running clothes, tied on my shoes, and I sat on my steps next to my front door. Becca's laughing because she remembers this, because I sat there for a bit, scrolling on my phone. Family members being like, "Are you gonna go run?" I'm like, "Yeah, eventually." And sometime later, felt like 20, but whatever. I took off my shoes and I changed out of my running clothes and I didn't run. And I did this same thing multiple days in a row. After a few days, I just stopped pretending I was going to run. I didn't want to run. I I mean, it's like this weird thing where I did want to run, but I couldn't get myself out. It sounded too hard. I didn't feel like it. And I went 4.5 weeks without running a single time. I'd occasionally get myself almost out the door, but I just couldn't get there. Until finally, I tapped into some friends, found some ways to get motivated to just get out of the house and move down the block. It helped that I saw the highest number on a scale that I'd ever seen in my life. And I got myself out there. And guess what? I didn't like it. I didn't enjoy myself at all. It felt painful and uncomfortable after just 4.5 weeks of not doing it. It felt like I had never run. And I was like, what is this? It took about 2 months rebuilding to 5 days a week before I finally found it again and was like, oh, okay, I enjoy this again. There's a deep truth here that I think is relevant for our spiritual lives. Desire often follows action. Almost all of AA, almost all of any 12-step program is actually built around this idea. That there are things that you have to do right now if you want to change. And you have to start right now before you feel like starting, before you feel like being sober and living a sober life. People who talk about and share their experiences of finding sobriety, of moving into it, talk about the beginning of sobriety as a nightmare. I don't know a single person who likes being sober in the first weeks and months of sobriety. But the program says that you have to live like a sober person before you want to start being a sober person long term. That you actually need to taste what it is like before you actually desire it longer term. Desire often follows action. It's really interesting when Jesus is speaking to his disciples at the end of Matthew, at the very end, he doesn't say, make disciples of all nations and teach them to want, teach them to desire all of the things of the kingdom. Jesus says, teach them to obey all the things I have taught you. That Jesus seems to get that there is something about starting to live into this way of life that he's offering us that will actually begin to change who we are and what we want. And there's a second truth here. Our desire grows for things that we do consistently, right? People who like running are people who actually run. People who like running the most are usually the people who run the most. The people who successfully get sober and stay sober are the people who go to 90-hour-long meetings in the first 90 days, what recovery programs call a 90 in 90. Now, let me just quickly remind us of the obvious counterpoint that we just considered last week, right? Just because you do a thing, whether it's play the piano, play a sport, go to an AA meeting, come to church, or whatever, doesn't mean you will enjoy it or even start to enjoy it. There's no guarantee in it. But as I suggested at the end of last week's message, while you might not grow to love a thing that you do every day, you will never grow to love a thing you never do. So let me just say it one more time. It's pretty simple, but I think we need to remember this. Like you might not grow to love a thing that you do every day, but you will never grow to love a thing that you never do. And so people who like running are people who actually run, and the people who like running the most are people who usually run the most. And I found this to be true about prayer as well. People who like praying are people who actually pray. And the people who like praying the most are usually the people who pray the most. Again, there are people who pray a lot who don't actually like prayer, and their motivations are a mess. They need to figure those out and take those before the Lord, but they're praying for any number of reasons, and God still wants to meet them in those prayers and can. But there's no guarantee, but I don't know anyone who truly likes praying who isn't also praying consistently. They might like the idea of praying, but it's hard to say they truly enjoy a thing that they never do. This morning, I want to explore all of this and how it might relate to the gift of the Lord's Prayer. In one of the earliest Christian documents, post-Bible being written, the books and the Gospels and the letters of the New Testament being written, it was written at the beginning of the 2nd century. It was a text on how to make disciples. We find young Christians being urged to pray the Lord's Prayer 3 times daily. This was consistent, totally consistent with the common Jewish practice of praying 3 times every day in these fixed ways. And I think that when we hear about specific fixed times of prayer, we can start to get a little nervous. Like, to us, fixed times of prayer, being told when to pray, can feel maybe like empty ritual. It can seem like hypocrisy. But I think it's really important for us to remember that as Jesus speaks to his Jewish crowd, as he gives the Sermon on the Mount, as he warns about hypocrisy, as he says, when you pray, he is assuming that the audience that is listening prays, right? And that they pray not just sporadically as they feel like it, but he actually assumes that these are people who are praying 3 times daily. And also they're praying at meals and when they go to the temple and when they need something, and also when they just feel like it. And Jesus never once tells anyone in the crowd to pray less. And he never tells them not to pray unless they really feel it or really believe it. Right? When he says, when you pray, he gives them a couple things not to do. He's real practical about it. Right? When you pray, don't do these couple things. Don't pray to be seen. Don't pray to impress anyone. Don't try to control God with your words, okay? He's real practical here. He tells them how to avoid some of the bad ways of praying, and they're bad because they're ways of praying that disconnect us from God and from the opportunity that prayer is to meet with God and be with God. But he also has practical positive advice, right? He says, when you pray, pray like this. And then tells them how to pray. I noticed that this section of the Sermon on the Mount, in the Sermon on the Mount, is intensely practical. And I noticed it when I was reading an author, Christopher Hall, who was reflecting on Augustine and Augustine's teaching from the 4th and 5th century. And you might recognize the name Augustine. Augustine was one of the most influential of the church fathers. If you were to read him today, there are several points where you would feel like you're listening to somebody today talking and expressing theology, some of the ways that we would articulate it. He wrote a bunch of books, major works, but he also wrote some letters, and we have some of those. And one of the letters that Augustine wrote was written to a woman named Proba. It's a weird name. But Proba had written to Augustine and wanted advice on how to pray. And according to Hall, Augustine responds to Proba in two ways. Augustine starts with the obstacles to prayer. Maybe you are aware of obstacles to prayer, things that keep you from praying, from going to God, from making God your first instinct. He warns Proba that she relies heavily on her family and on her personal wealth to provide her with comfort and apparent security, and that these are obstacles to prayer. Hall writes, Augustine encourages Proba to remember and meditate on life's brevity and death's inevitable embrace. Such meditations will serve to reorient her perspective on who and what brings lasting, genuine happiness and security. Because ultimately, Hall believes, Augustine is sure of this, that a skewed perspective on life will lead to skewed prayers. In other words, Augustine is doing upfront work to make sure that Proba's praying is rightly oriented. But then Augustine gets really practical. Pray to God in words at certain fixed hours and times. That's pretty practical, right? So that we may encourage ourselves and take note of how much progress we have made in this desire. So the progress isn't, am I praying more often? It's, am I growing in my desire to be present with God in prayer? And may rouse ourselves more earnestly to increase in it. Again, by setting fixed hours and times, there is for Augustine this hope that there would be this stirred excitement of like, wow, 3 times a day with God, it's just not doing it for me. I need more because God's presence is so full of life and light, and I need all that God is and a little bit of a taste. Regular tastes make us hunger for more of him. And Augustine says, the more fervent the desire, the more worthy the fact which results. Augustine urges Proba to pray at fixed hours and times daily. He urges her to use the Lord's Prayer at those times. He trains her to prepare her heart for prayer before those times, and he tells her to pray consistently and on a regular, planned basis. Augustine, 300 years after the Didache, right, he continues this tradition of praying the Lord's Prayer daily, multiple times a day. And it struck me this week when I was reading Christopher Hall describing this relationship between Augustine and Proba. At one point, Hall just describes Augustine coaching Proba. And it's funny because we don't think of coaches in the 1st century or the 4th century, but that's exactly what Augustine was doing. He was teaching Proba to practice prayer daily, giving very practical insights about how and when. This is exactly what the Didache was doing for the earliest disciples of Jesus post the apostles. And then it's exactly what Jesus is doing here on the Sermon on the Mount as he says, do this when you pray and don't do this when you pray. And it kind of struck me for the first time in my life that as I have this summer stepped into coaching a sport, that I've actually never coached anyone or anything, not in a sport anyway. And so I'm like learning like what it takes to coach someone. And I had this experience this summer where I have this freshman girl who's been running with us all summer with knee pain. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to say to her. I was nervous that I would say the wrong thing. I had some ideas, but I wasn't really sure. And I actually figured out what was happening to her knee one day while we were just running. I was running with a couple students, and we were kind of in the very back, and she was ahead of us. And then I realized the problem. Her knees banged together on every single stride. And it would cause her feet to then kind of flail out after her knees hit. We're not meant to run that way. Problem found. Now here's the deal, right? She has knee pain, she's hurting, but I never told her to stop running until she figured out how to run right. To fix this, to save her knee, she actually needs to keep running. And she needs to learn how to run well while she's doing it. And so what I was able to give her was this set of drills that will actually retrain the motion of her legs, the direction of her legs. These drills that she will start to do will actually begin to repattern her movements so that her legs move straight and her knees don't bang anymore. And so I've given her these drills, and one day right before practice, we got there early so I could show her how to do them. I could model them, and then I had her do them for me, and then I was able to tweak her form as she did it, and I was able to give her some tips, and now she has these drills, and she is doing them daily. She needs to do them daily to reprogram the connection between her brain and her legs. This is exactly what the Lord's Prayer is doing for a praying people. Jesus is talking to people who already pray, and he doesn't say, stop praying until you figure out how to pray. No, he says, keep drawing near to God, keep drawing close, but while you pray, pray in this way. If you have any of these bad habits, stop those. Those are not going to be good for you and your relationship with God or anyone else, so stop those. But while you're praying, drill these new habits, these new grooves into your conversations with God. Each line of this prayer is a drill of its own to do and to redo as often as possible so that our hearts might be changed, our hearts might be reoriented, our praying reformed. Jesus tells his disciples to pray like this. His disciples, they develop a habit of praying this prayer 3 times a day, right? They're retraining their prayer muscles. Augustine picks up the same practice. Someone doesn't enjoy prayer, proba, she doesn't like it, she doesn't know how to do it. Augustine's really practical, okay? Examine the things that you're relying on. So check your motives as you come to God in prayer, and then keep praying. Practice turning to God frequently and often. In fact, at set times, to make sure that it's truly a priority that will change who you are. And so I've been thinking about this, and I've wondered what it would look like in the spirit of Jesus and the disciples and the Didache and Augustine. What would it look like if I thought of myself and my role as pastor as also like spiritual coach? I don't know if that's appropriate or not, but if I were a coach in the same way that I'm a coach for runners, what would it look like? What tips would I give? How would I work like the Didache or Augustine to guide our praying together? What would I do or say that would help us to obey everything that Jesus taught? I don't know. I kind of do. I have some guesses, and I'm curious how you hear this. But I think at a minimum, some of you may already be doing this. But I think it would change our lives. It would change our praying lives. It would change our relationship with God if we took a moment at the same time each day to just consider any or all of the things that we are relying on besides God. So what are those people? What are those sources that I am turning to before I'm inclined to say, our Father? And then what if at that same moment, that same time each day, just then prayed the Lord's Prayer every day? That would be the advice, the praying advice I would give to beginners. The next step, I think, would be to pray the Lord's Prayer each day with someone else. It could be someone that you live with, or it could be someone in your neighborhood. But there is something about the fact that the very first word of the Lord's Prayer is our, that immediately ties us to a family of people that says, this is clearly a prayer to be prayed with other people. Can we say, our Father? And then for those who are growing in their desire to pray, the next step would be adding 2 other fixed times of prayer each day. I don't think it would hurt to add the Lord's Prayer to those fixed times, but it might not be necessary. But in all of this, right, the point is the same. Any of this advice, any of these suggestions or directions would be to help us do what we need to do, which is to just show up before God. To just show up, to open our lives before Him, to be present to the God who has given us everything, but who we so quickly forget about as the source of everything we need. The point of praying at fixed times and in fixed ways is to create a habit of turning our attention and our hearts toward God. It is to create a habit of turning our attention away from ourselves. We were made by a God who put prayer in our hearts, and He is so eager to hear from us. As often as we will pay attention to Him, but not so that we simply do it, but as we do it, to recognize, to remember that we are encountering the God of all creation, the Lord of our lives. God wants us to enjoy His very presence as we draw near to Him in prayer. The Lord's Prayer is a gift to compel us to make that move.